Hello, welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today, John Euler, Dr. Ann Gillies, and Connie Raguli are here. They're going to discuss, well, how the perpetrator or predator actually invades the family home. There are many different situations with regards to individuals being led on by things like pornography these days. Obviously, the LGBTQ++.II stuff is also making its way into families and households all across. Connie is an attorney, and she brings a world of information today to the table. So let's bring in John Euler right now and Dr. Ann and Connie all at the same time. Thank you very much all for being here. Connie has a compelling story as well. So John, I'll let you take it away.
Brett, thank you. We come from a lot of different perspectives as far as looking at facets of the trans movement, both from a macro and micro perspective, looking at big special interests, and then all the way down to things that are impacting individuals. With regard to this movement, especially those things that predators are using. And Brad, one of the things they're using is pornography, and that is what brings about deviance. Connie Raguli is with us. She is an attorney. And Ann, you and Connie have a lot in common in terms of Connie has decades worth of experience involved in legal cases representing those that have been impacted by porn-fueled deviant individuals, those that may know kids outside the family or some that are even in the family. And your own experience was very powerful. You wrote a book about it. Please introduce Connie to us, because as your family was directly impacted by the likes of what we're going to be talking about today.
Absolutely, John. So Connie is a private attorney and was, or still is, a prosecutor. And I wish she had been my attorney by just talking with her, because she's going to discuss some very, very important information, not only about the predators among us, that's the title of my book, but also talking about the children who have experienced sexual abuse in the home, incest in the home from dad, and then the justice system. So we're going to have some pretty interesting conversations. So Connie, we want to start with you. We want to invite you just to talk a little bit, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in all this. And certainly from the prosecution perspective, that's really going to be helpful to individuals who may themselves be experiencing something like we've been through. And I think your information is going to be very, very important.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ann and John. And, I am licensed to practice law in the state of Tennessee. I am not currently a prosecutor, but when law was a second career for me. I came into it. The very first job I had was prosecuting as a county prosecutor up in Nashville, Davidson County, and did a lot of domestic violence, child abuse, et cetera. Well, then I went into private practice. And over the past 3 decades, I have worked with family after family after family that have had the horrible experience of having sexual abuse within the family unit. And, I've worked with prosecutors, I've worked with professional psychologists, I've worked with these clients and moms and protected parents and children. And it's just heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking. So, I've met John and had conversations with him about a couple of particular cases that I had, and really appreciate the work and got to know about his history and the work that he did with predators. So I have recently been involved in a case which I happen to have a lot of personal knowledge about. I want to protect the victims in this case and not really get into their names, but I just hope that people will trust that based upon my experience, I'm going to share with them, and we're going to have some conversations about what that process and what the predator and the child goes through. And I'm doing this for a very special purpose. And that's because I want more predators to be prosecuted. And the only way to really do that is to for the people who are involved, for the parents, the family members, the school teachers, the counselors, for them to really look at this whole thing more globally and not just on a day-to-day basis. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to come here with both of you who also have experience in this and have this discussion.
It's really interesting. Oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Connie, how this pertains to unmasking the trans movement is you yourself have seen the extent to which pornography and deviance then can make its way into a family, or it doesn't have to be in a family, but in this case, you're going to be referencing a situation where there was incest and a lot of deviance was found by the on the electronics and bringing to bear this influence then, and the same kind of deviance that's within the trans movement.
Right, you're right. And, you know, and I am in Nashville, Tennessee. I didn't put that out there, but for, I think, the whole nation, this is, here we are today, April the 26th. And I think probably the whole nation knows about the events that occurred in Nashville just a few weeks ago with a trans man, Miss Audrey Hale, I think is her name, who went
biological female.
Yeah, biological female who went into a Christian school and opened fire. And I'm very active with our state legislature. So all of this was going on while I was working with the legislature. I'm also I've had dealings with cases, family law cases, where very young children are getting exposed to anime, explicit, graphic sexual content, and it's frightening. So I really, if we take a look at the predator and just what are some things about a predator, just their conduct, their behavior, their environment that they surround them on, and any one of these particular things may not trigger anybody to say, oh yeah, they're a predator, because, you know, I'm very careful about that. It's like, just because somebody goes to a party doesn't mean they're a predator. No, I agree. But when you start gathering evidence, and I tell a lot of people that before I went to law school, I did my master's in psychology. So I approach law perhaps a little bit differently than most lawyers. But when you look at globally all of these different characteristics and elements, we want people to super be tuned into those. And really, I mean, I hate to say keep score, but yeah, it is kind of keep score. So whether your daughter is involved with somebody as a partner, or whether you have a grandchild that is either in a situation with even an intact family, I hate to say, but in particular where there are step parents or boyfriends, because we do know statistically the high level of sexual abuse that comes from non-related males in the home, but it's also related males. And, you know, I've had cases where the fathers are professors and doctors and veterinarians, and still young children have been perpetrated on.
It doesn't matter what color the collar, right?
Right.
What color the collar, you know, the reality is, and John talks about this, and the level of perpetrators within white collar individuals and those in high levels of responsibility, governmental levels, you know, school teachers. We have a whole, just a whole gamut of individuals, and who are now, over the last 2 or 3 decades, have become very highly sexualized through the media and the culture, and more lately through, you know, the cell phone and you know, the visual porn, and you know, then they want to act it out on children, and this is creating a crisis across our nations.
Yes. And so,
Connie, walk us through the characteristics.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and again, this particular case that I was close to, it wasn't just an instant in time. It was over a period of years. So I had experience in seeing the characteristics of the perpetrator develop very, very closely. So, you know, a lot of times as an attorney, you might get called in as a last minute, right? But these are some of the things that are so important. And the first one is culture. And of course, in this particular case, I didn't really have any evidence, or we didn't really have any evidence of child pornography being distributed or being placed among them. But this is the predator had a habit and immersed himself in this culture that was totally manufactured. It was having these penthouse parties with people who all pretended to be wealthy, the young girls in very over-sexualized outfits with, of course, their boobs all hanging out in short, tight, skin-tight dresses, and the men in the videos, and this person used an Instagram account to actually profiteer himself in these environments, like take pictures of himself with Rolls Royces and jet planes, making himself look very, very wealthy, putting himself in a costume caricature like situation, wearing plastic crowns, and just it was a culture that was obviously a subculture. And this is all the time. He was married. He had children. There was a lot of sort of domestic violence going on within that household, of isolation of the mother, and of really discounting the children, not appearing to even be interested in the children when they're very young, and spending time away from the home at night, adultery. I mean, just a culture that is something you obviously have clues about. What is that culture that they're putting themselves in? So that is the first thing that I really began to notice, and I began to watch. And then there's this whole series of other behaviors, other fraudulent, sneaky, transactional behaviors out in the public, financial fraud with the bank, tax fraud with, intentionally not filing tax returns, creating fake lawsuits to file against people, and this entitlement and arrogance that came with that, of thinking that people owed him things, that he shouldn't have to pay for things. And so, those are just the first couple of things that I saw, that you could see this creature, if you will, beginning to develop, and in the language to use in communicating with others who should have been people who were personally support people for him. I mean, the people around him, relatives, who he was intentionally, and it's worse than betraying. It's treating them with disdain, right? It's that disdain. So those are a couple of the first things that I noticed. And I mean, have you seen any of those things as well?
Can you talk about employment, or lack thereof of employment? Because something that you had written earlier that I read just really resonated with me, because with my first husband, who was a predator, who perped on our children, raped our boys, and he had long periods of unemployment.
Yes.
Lots of time on his hands, and he wouldn't get a job. And so, which took me out of the home more. And I'm not, that was just the reality, but it gave him more opportunity. Did you see that in many of these cases?
Yes. So, well, it kind of goes both ways, I will say, but there is a strong pattern of unemployment, and that unemployment is very odd, because there seems to be no particular reason for the unemployment. In other words, there are people who have job skills, who maybe had decent jobs at a different period in their life, and yet, and in this particular case, it was almost an attitude of too good to work. And it was somebody who believed they were individually talented enough, or they could make themselves a social media personality to be able to generate income. And yet all the time talking about and taking pictures of expensive things. And there was one posting on Instagram where he showed a picture of himself all lounged back in a Rolls Royce. And his comment on it was, "Do you want to talk to my attorney or my broker? I have 12 of each," which is an absolute fake falsity. I mean, which I know is not good English there, but it was just an absolute just creation in his own mind. And so, yes, that employment issue is huge. And then the other thing I noticed was this growing emboldenment of getting away with, and again, relating back to some of these other behaviors, even with those, getting away with that and not getting caught with it. I know in his particular case, he had an accident on the highway, and I believe he was drinking at the time. And instead of reporting it, he drove his car all the way home because he didn't want to be caught drinking. But then he thought he'd gotten away with it, right? And he reported to his insurance that somebody had hit and run him. And I mean, it was total insurance fraud. And yet he got away with it. Some of the financial fraud, he got away with it. Nobody came after him for it. And and I used to say this when I was a district attorney, whenever I would have a rap sheet, right, that was like unfolded like, a Rand McNally map of the states, you knew that there was this increasing risk taking, right? This increased risk taking because there's no consequence. And so this pattern of emboldenment, which later then became the impetus for ever increasing sexual aggression against a child, but it's that risk-taking behavior that you also see in all of these other areas.
And that's another way of saying pushing boundaries. Right?
Yeah.
They push boundaries and nothing happens to them. As you're talking, I'm thinking of the men that I've worked with in sex offender treatment. Connie and Ann, you have referenced the different kinds of guys. And it's interesting because you can have the impulsive, outwardly unsophisticated kind of individual or sophisticated, but either way, they're pushing boundaries. And when nothing happens, they start to become deluded that they're on a roll. And we call that eventually becoming sloppy. But they've become so used to getting away with it. So by the time they're finally busted, they'll say, well, that's the first time. No, this has been going on for years. It finally caught up with them, or they finally slipped up.
Yeah. And again, the distinction between this, the legal aspect of this and the psychological aspect, because I look at both things, when you in a legal forum, you can't use prior bad acts, or you can't like attack the character of somebody to prove that they're guilty of a crime. But yet, that when you see these patterns of things and you see this growing emboldenment, that there is something going on that is getting just much more aggressive. And so the next thing was this whole, and this kind of goes in after the emboldenment, this whole series of microaggression. And I call it microaggression only because it's not a fist in the chin. It's things like text messaging and stalking and talking down, downplaying the other person, right? To engaging a third party to denigrate the protective parent, for instance, or to even denigrate the child and begin to make the child look like they're not sane, right? Because that's one of the methods that you want to do, is talk about to discredit, because ultimately this aggressor is ultimately, we now saw, as I saw being on the tail end of it, the aggressor's only defense ultimately at the end of the day is to discredit the people who are telling the story, who are telling the facts, discredit the protective parent, discredit other siblings, discredit the victim. So this microaggression is this constant engaging them and trying to trigger them to say, bad things. And of course, these days as an attorney, I know text messages always end up in court, right? Text messages, emails, they always end up in court. And so if you can trigger, for instance, a protective parent enough, and they say something horrible back, they can take that then and use it in court to discredit them. And then, of course, after, the next thing that comes is blame shifting, right? It must have been somebody else. It must have been somebody else that perpetrated. And this was a big defense in this case. It wasn't me, it was somebody else, which became very interesting because it sort of shifted the narrative from it didn't happen at all to it happened, but it wasn't me. And I think this is so characteristic of when there's a real predator involved, that something has happened. And then finally, this last one I want to hit on, and then we can, I'd like to engage you in a discussion on these, is escalation. And so once all these other things have started working, the aggression, the predator behavior escalates. It escalates. They're emboldened. They push the boundaries. They've blame shifted. They've discredited the victim. And this is the most frightening phase of all, is the escalation.
I think what you're talking about is just so important, because it is this upward momentum that you're talking about. Can I ask you, in maybe not this case, but other cases that you've had, do you often find that the predator has threatened the children?
Yeah. Oh, every time.
Okay.
Everything from, every single case I've ever touched on in 3 decades, there's been, the child finally says, I was told not to tell.
100%, Connie, 100%. Right. And people keep doing sex offender treatment. Right. Once it finally comes out, these guys are going to deny this. People need to understand this is who we're talking about. They will keep going.
Well, they will always say, don't tell anybody. Now, from that, that's the given. They're going to say that. Now, there's a few variations that spring off from that. One of them is, you'll get in trouble if you tell. Number 2 is, you might never see daddy again if you tell. Number 3 is, mommy will get in trouble, which is the real ringer, right? If you tell, you're going to get your mommy in trouble. So there's all these variations that spring up from that. But every single time a child is told not what is told, don't tell. Now, and we're going to move, as we move into the second part of this and the child, I want to talk more about that as well, because whether or not a child discloses how, what, when, where, you have to assume the child has been told by the predator, don't tell anybody.
That's right. And for my children, I asked that question purposely because my children were threatened with their lives. Either they would be killed or I would be killed. And so, that's the ultimate threat. You put up with this absolute horrific sodomy that's going on, or I'll kill your mother, and what child is going to tell anyone anything?
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Connie, what's so important for people to understand, and as it pertains to the trans movement, is predators are going to seek out any kind of venue, any kind of context where kids are plentiful, they are able to be easily accessed, and you have trusting and or believing adults. Think about the trans movement. You have men. Now, does this mean that every single adult part of the trans movement is a predator? We are not saying that, but the question is this. Is someone going to try to make the case that there are no predators that have made the trans movement the perfect hunting ground? There are predators everywhere. All a predator needs is for someone to give them the benefit of the doubt. Now, we're not recommending we all become jaded. That's not what we're suggesting, but discerning and protective. Yet the trans movement has so done the work, in a way, of the predator in this sense, that it has caused all good people, especially potential victims and victims, to dumb down their intuition, meaning not to rely upon their intuition, that sixth sense that says something's kind of creepy. Why is this man wanting to come into the shower area with me? Why is right? And so these guys, as they become psychopathic, two kinds of psychopaths, a bloody psychopath and a white collar psychopath. Psychopath simply means no conscience, therefore no empathy, no remorse. Since they also are expert in impression management, they know how to do the big lie theory. They know how to tell big whoppers while looking you straight in the camera. We're all familiar with one guy that said, I did not have sex with that woman, and I'm tired of this right-wing conspiracy. I have to get back to work, the job that the American people voted me, right? It's like, depends upon what is, okay, right? And they can look you in the eye, and therefore they can say, I just want to swim on a woman's swim team. I feel afraid to go into prison because I'm going to be targeted, so I need to go into a female prison. I need to go into a women's rape shelter. I need to go into the restroom or the shower area that I identify with. And what happens? Everybody says, oh, they seem so sincere. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they are ravenous wolves, and they are exactly as you're talking about. These are the most aggressive in terms of chess. You know, they fancy themselves, it's game theory, it's chess masters, so they can pour it on, whether in churches. Predators love going to church. They love going to the trans movement, right? Because you have believing adults. And so, Connie, speak again to what you have seen and you lived it, that these guys are so powerful in being able to maintain a ruse, and then especially if the perpetration's in the family, right? This guy's turned it on at church or in whatever public setting, and everybody behind the scenes knows this guy's leading a double life, but because he's so prolific at turning it on, that even sets the victims back on their heels even more, because people think he's a wonderful guy. But meanwhile, what's going on behind closed doors is horrific, and now it's like double jeopardy.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because I'm going to add sort of another aspect of this. I don't know that I truly covered this, but the whole lack of empathy, right, for the victim. And if you look at that and that lack of empathy, there are all kinds of clues about that in their other transactional relationships, right? So in a party setting, right, it's the kind of person who dominates about me. In a family setting, it's a person, again, who wants to dominate a conversation and keep that conversation directed to something totally separate from the well-being of the children, the welfare of the children. How are the children doing? Not engaging the children. The acts of sexual violence against a child now, and I'm talking primarily, I think there's a difference between the prepubescent child and then the child, say 13 to 17. I think those are two sort of totally different topics or conversations we need to have. But that prepubescent child under 12 years old is everything you said. They are totally unawares. They don't understand what sexualization is. They don't even understand that. They don't understand when there's certain touching that is done to them, that they don't even get that that's sexual contact. They don't even know that's sexual contact. And they can only are learning that from the reaction of the predator. And I still don't think they understand it. So, you know, this
Connie, the perpetrators now are playing on, they always have, but especially now, and the UN is pushing this, the idea of consent. Well, meaning if the child didn't flail and scream bloody murder, so to speak, there was implied consent. Right. And a child under 12, a prepubescent child,
even when you talk about their sixth sense and their, they are not, if you raise children at ages, up through 12 years old to be totally afraid of every stranger, which we hate to do, right? We don't want to make them like totally paranoid so they can't say hello to somebody in the grocery store who walks up and says hello to them. But they don't have that sixth sense because they're not even processing that as a potentially bad experience, right? As opposed to, children who get older or young adults who should have more of that intact. So absolutely, that lack of empathy, and then, the child as the victim is just heartbreaking.
And, you've lived it. You lived through this and you saw your kids, and what's going through your mind right now?
Well,
again, go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I'll just finish up with this, that there's a couple things going through my mind. Number one, this was, for me, it was 40 years ago and about 30 years ago that we actually went to court. But the other thing I see happening, and I think this speaks to a broader issue we can talk about, the young children under 12 are being sexualized in the education system, not in the sense of showing the right to refusal, but to they're being instructed on how to receive inappropriate touch. They are actually, of course, being extremely sexualized in the classroom, which puts a whole other layer on all of this discussion that wasn't there even 10 years ago. So it's very, very hard now to actually ascertain for a therapist what child has been sexually abused, unless it's very out there and they're talking about it. Because as far as I'm concerned, the children are being sexually abused in the classroom, because it is abusive to expose children to such sexual pictures and all of the things they're doing at that age. So it becomes very complicated. And I think, Connie, you're probably going to be seeing lots of that in the future as well.
Connie, why can't we hold these people accountable? What's that going to take?
So in our part 3, I want to talk more about the investigative process and sort of people, so that people can kind of understand that, and then understand if they are in this situation, whether personally or they're a teacher or a friend or family or somehow has some association with it, there are certain things that they can learn to do to help protect the case, basically, once there's a disclosure.
Well, part 3 is going to be compelling as well. John, there's a lot to come in part 2 as well. Why don't you give us a brief rundown right now what our viewers can expect for part 2?
Brad, Connie has just given us an overview of the profile of a predator, the mindset, the characteristics. We're going to look at the child now, the characteristics of a child that is being groomed and being abused. It's crucial information from an attorney who has been on many, many cases, and we're just so appreciative. So, Connie, we look forward to the second half as we do a deep dive into the profile of the child that is being harmed.
Thank you all very much for being here. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement. Remember, you can find us on BitChute. Just search Unmasking the Trans Movement. All of our episodes are there as well. You can find us on our website, too. We call it home, unmaskingthetransmovement.com. We have resourceful information there to help parents and grandparents in this, well, we'll just say unmasking this trans movement. I'm Brad Wilder. For John Euler, Dr. Ann Gillies, and Connie will be back soon.